Hello, and thank you for joining us for this webinar Wednesday. My name is Sharon, and I'm with the Statewide Internet Portal Authority, your Colorado government authority, helping you get more information and services online. In today's webinar, we are going to learn about building a culture of accessibility from the team at Slalom. Before we get started, please go ahead and turn on captioning if you need or desire, and note that during this webinar, you are muted. If you have questions or would like to communicate with the presenters at any point during the webinar, please use the chat box or Q&A feature. We will unmute everyone at the end for any remaining questions that you may have. We'll also have some poll questions for you during the presentation for you to answer and a post-webinar survey, and we deeply appreciate your feedback. Please join me in welcoming our speakers, Dan Flesher, Rebecca Sosa, Matt Bennett, and Tim Banker. We appreciate their time and look forward to what they have to share. Also on the call is SIPA's Sales and Marketing Director, Beth Justice, Customer Success Director, Dwayne Tucker, and I believe we're going to have Sales Operations Manager, Heather Nelson, and Operations Assistant, Sarah Fisher, at some point. So if you have any questions for us, we'd love to have them. Thank you all for joining us today. With that, I will turn it over to the Slalom team.
Sounds great. Thank you, Sharon, and thank you all for joining us here today. As Sharon mentioned, we're here to talk about building a culture of accessibility. Today's agenda, we're going to go through some quick introductions just about who we are. We're going to dive into that topic of building a culture of accessibility at a higher level. And then we're going to take a look at some practical ways that you can implement that in your organizations, including how you can start evaluating your accessibility, training and change management you can use to sustain your accessibility efforts over time, and what it looks like to put together a roadmap for all of these different components that go into building that culture. So just a quick intro on who Slalom is. So really wanted to center this around our vision and our purpose as an organization. So our vision is to help create a world in which each person has the opportunity to love their life and work. And our purpose is to help organizations dream bigger, move faster, and build better tomorrows for all. So a lot about in our mission really helps to encapsulate some of the spirit of accessibility and some of the things that we'll talk about with you all today. So, this topic is really close to our hearts in our organization. Folks that'll be presenting today. So I'm Dan Flesher. I'm an accessibility specialist and UX designer in our experience practice here in Denver, Colorado. Joining me on the call today is Rebecca Sosa, a leader on our experience team and our Accessibility Center of Excellence lead here in Denver. A couple other colleagues have joined us here today to help answer questions and join in. That's Matt Bennett and Tim Banker. So you may hear from them during this presentation as well. So enough about who we are. Let's dive into the topic that you're all here to learn about today, which is building a culture of accessibility. You'll see that Sharon has brought up a poll question here to help introduce the topic, just looking to understand from folks on that scale of 1 to 5, how integrated is accessibility into your organization's overall strategic planning and decision-making process? What we'll talk about today is really, this is the key in making sure that we can not only get accessible, but stay accessible, is making this a part of your way of working. So curious to understand from folks on the call, how well is this kind of baked into that larger strategic planning and decision-making process? Looks like we have some answers in the chat. All right, we'll let folks answer that and then hopefully see the results here in a second. There we go. So it looks like a lot of folks kind of heavy in that 3 to 2 range, about 60% of folks so in that kind of middle of the bell curve. A couple folks in that 1, a couple folks on the 5 end. So it looks like, as expected, right, there's varying degrees of how this has been incorporated today. Hopefully still even the 5s and the 4s, everyone will have a nice takeaway from this presentation and get a chance to answer, get some of your questions answered. Let's talk more about building that culture. And I wanted to start with a quote from someone I follow on LinkedIn, someone who's very involved in the accessibility space, who contributes to the W3 standards, not a Slalom employee, but someone I recommend you follow on LinkedIn and learn a lot of great accessibility tips from them, Sherry Byrne-Haber. But she had a quote that she posted that says, "Accessibility is not a problem to be solved. It's a culture to be built." And that really resonated with us here and the work that we look to do. When we see organizations that try to go with accessibility as a problem to be solved, they tend to be creating problems as quickly as they can solve them. And it tends to take more effort, more time, and more intensity to create that accessible organization. Whereas folks that bake it in and build it into the culture, build it into their ways of working, and really infuse it throughout everything that they do, they are more efficient, they are more effective, they're not creating as many problems. So, the problem solvers tend to have a lot of rocks they're always trying to break down, whereas the culture builders tend to have a lot fewer things to deal with because it's so infused into how they do their work. So before we get too far, let's just kind of ground ourselves in talking about what accessibility means and how we define it. There's plenty of great definitions out there. This is the one that we use, and really we're talking about creating digital and physical products and experiences that are usable by everyone, including people with disabilities. A lot of the common questions we hear from organizations: how can we make our website and content more accessible? So that very practical step. How can we empower our teams to bake accessibility into their work? This is a great culture building question. And then certainly a lot of folks, especially your legal departments, your compliance teams, are certainly looking to know what is our reputational and legal risk if we aren't accessible. I know everyone is zoomed in on the potential financial penalties outlined in House Bill 211110, so we know that's top of mind for folks as well. On the right-hand side here, we have this Venn diagram showing the intersection of technology, people, and process. And the reason that we think this is important: when we talk about the accessibility space, a lot of people tend to start in technology, in the tool space. They think it is IT will own accessibility fully across our organization. And while IT and technology do have a big role to play, this is really something we want to drive across teams, across divisions, and organization-wide to really build that culture. So there's absolutely a people aspect. Behind all the tools, behind all the technology are people. People that need to have the skills in knowing how to implement accessibility, knowing what to spot if there could be potential issues. The people that are bought into the mission of accessibility and why it's important. And certainly we need to be thinking about our processes as well. If we're not having our processes inclusive of accessibility from start to finish, if we're not creating shared responsibilities, it's easy for those cracks and those issues to slip through. So by supporting accessibility processes that bake it in, we really are able to achieve that sustainable effort over time. So we really think of these three pillars as the levers you use to drive accessibility forward. How is accessibility achieved? So what does this journey look like for a lot of organizations? To know where we're going, we have to figure out where we are at a certain point in time. We need to understand the current state. And that often starts with an assessment. How accessible are our websites today? How accessible are our documents? Is our training content? How accessible are media that we produce, like webinars or podcasts? And starting with that assessment and evaluation. Once we have a good handle on that, we figure out where we need to implement critical and key fixes to improve the accessibility and make sure that everyone is able to access our great content, our important services, all of those great things that your organization is doing across the state. And then really this is where we think about how do we sustain that over time? If you just do assessment and remediation, you're going to be kind of stuck in that loop forever of finding new problems and solving them and finding new problems and solving them. But when we think about sustainable systems and processes, when we think about ways we can monitor, leverage data, and improve over time, that's where we see this, initial spike in effort for our first assessment and remediation start to level out over time. We figure out how to build those efficiencies and build this into our way of working to sustain those great things that we're doing, introduce fewer issues, and really be able to manage programs like accessibility in a very sustainable, effective, efficient way over time. So with that, we want to take the next couple sections to dive into specific areas of building that culture, starting with evaluating accessibility. And we do have another poll question for you on a scale of 1 to 5. how would you rate your organization's current level of accessibility implementation on its digital platform? So how far are you into that evaluation stage? How much have you had a chance to remediate? Where do you feel your organization is on that scale of implementation? Looks like it's 0 to 5. So 0 is that kind of very low, or 5 very high. All right. Unsurprisingly, looks like we've got a lot of folks in the kind of, again, the middle of this bell curve. The majority of respondents, 39% in that 2 range, a number of folks in the 3. And then still we've got some folks on the other end, folks maybe just getting started, as well as folks that, you know, have moved further as an organization in identifying and fixing some of those issues that you found.
I'm happy to see 0 zeros.
That is wonderful to see. So in terms of evaluation, right, where do we start? And to start, we need to figure out what our digital inventory comprises. So as you probably know, House Bill 211110 is very inclusive at a broad range of what it covers from an accessibility standpoint. I think if it has a pixel, it is covered under that House bill. And so what are those big areas that we might apply some focus within your organization? So certainly websites. I think every organization has at least one public-facing website, and many internal-facing websites as well. And we've seen a number of organizations that have subsites specific to certain services or programs that you may run. So we certainly want to get a wide look there. Documents is a huge one, at least by count. Everyone across the organization tends to create documents that they are sharing within their teams, sharing across the organization, even sharing with the public. These are things you can think of, your Office Suite documents or your Google Suite documents, as well as those notoriously tricky PDFs. We also have applications. Certainly if your organization supports any mobile apps, again, either internal or public, both of those are covered, as well as software. What are the tools your team has procured to do their job? What SaaS platforms is your company using to create service tickets or track time or doing a lot of those other things that organizations, learning platforms? Those certainly need to be evaluated for accessibility as well. In 2024, a lot of folks are creating more and more media all the time. You may have videos you post to YouTube. You may create podcasts. You may have webinars. Certainly, a lot of folks have social media posts. How do we think about accessibility in those domains as well? And then another space that we call phygital. These are physical representations of digital content. So here we have kiosks and signage. If you think about self-checkout at King Soopers, if you think about ATMs, right, those have digital components, but are also the accessibility matters in how they are physically present as well. What options do they have for accessibility? How can people access them? So certainly an important dimension as well. And so all of these could be part of your digital inventory, and those nooks and crannies in your organization you need to look into to see where these are. And again, a lot of folks tend to think of, well, IT, they do websites, they do apps, this is on them. But it is organization-wide. Every department is creating documents. Many have their own software they use to complete their tasks. Many of them may be completing or releasing media content as well. So this really is organization-wide when we think of that digital inventory. So in working with organizations to put these together, what have we learned? The inventory is large, oftentimes almost overwhelmingly so. There's a ton of assets across the organizations and all of those different pockets of websites and documents and apps that we need to survey and understand. Because it is so large, there may be accessibility gaps now and in the future. So one thing we'll talk about later is making sure you have a process by which you can receive and respond to accessibility feedback if anyone has trouble with any of the content or digital assets that you all maintain. As we saw in that previous slide, the inventory is varied. It is in all formats. It is photos, videos, websites, PDFs, apps, everything that you can possibly think of. Each of those does have often their own considerations for what accessibility means in that domain and what that means to the people that maintain those. So we need to support folks with training and tools that helps them understand the skills and have the ability to make the digital assets they're responsible for more accessible. And one thing I've continued to mention is this is organization-wide. We need to create a sense of shared ownership and shared buy-in across the organization to make sure that, we're not just focusing on one website or one app, but we're bringing full organization behind this accessibility effort and really getting to all those different pockets of content your organization may support. Anytime we're thinking of things that is organization-wide, we need to have a strong change management and governance strategy to coach people through this really large change. We've seen a lot of overwhelm with folks as they first start to learn this. And so we need to think about the best ways to support them through that change to make sure it's not overly burdensome, that they feel heard and supported, and that it really sticks and sustains over time. So how we think about prioritizing what we can do with these assets once we start to find where they are, is we tend to look at two dimensions, so impact and effort. Your friends at OIT gave a really great way for impact to look at both strategic and community impact. So, is this part of a critical service that we offer to the public? Is this a critical document in helping people internally understand how to do their job and complete the tasks they're responsible for? Those are some of the kind of questions we can use to understand what is the impact of this particular site or document or piece of content that we put out there. The other dimension that we often try to look at is effort as well. So once we start figuring out what content should we work on first, what digital assets, you'll see here on this matrix, things that are high impact and low effort really represent quick wins that your organization might be able to capture and build on to kind of build that momentum over time. Then from there, we can start to get a little more strategic. Some of those things that are high impact and high effort, or low impact, low effort, how do we start to build that roadmap over time to make sure that we are serving our community and our internal employees as well as we can with the time that we have. So when it comes to actually evaluating accessibility, what are the tools and techniques that we need to understand? So a good place to start is always automated testing. These leverage tools like scanners to help quickly review your websites and your documents and spot any accessibility issues that are found. Websites can be scanned with a tool like SiteImprove that many of you may be using in your organization today. For documents, Microsoft and Adobe both have built-in checkers that can be leveraged. If you are a Google Suite user, they tend to offer not quite as much accessibility support as the Microsoft Office suite, but there are tools out there like Grackle that can help you evaluate accessibility as well. Now, with automated testing, this tends to cover maybe 30 to 50%, at least on the web side of things, issues. And so to get to that click further, to really understand the full scope of accessibility, we need to dive into some manual testing as well. So a lot of these accessibility issues can only be identified by humans. This is checking alt text to make sure it's meaningful, not simply that it's present. Is the reading order of our documents and sites logical? Are we using color as the only way to convey meaning? So if you've got a status document out there that says status green, status red, right? That might not be accessible for some folks, but that is not something that a scanner can pick up on. Accuracy of captions as well. There's a number of issues that we need humans to take the time to go in and evaluate to really get that full picture of our digital accessibility. Now, over time, as you use these testing methods to identify issues and resolve them, one thing we want to encourage folks to use is find ways to involve people with disabilities in testing the experience of your content. I can use a screen reader to navigate a website. I can use keyboard testing, but I don't use that every day to experience the content. So it's best to involve folks that have that lived experience to do that testing for you. Now, unless their role is accessibility tester, I would encourage you not to knowingly present these folks with knowingly broken content that has large accessibility barriers. That's not helpful and will really be frustrating. This is kind of as you make your content more accessible and you want help understanding what is that experience really like for someone using a screen reader. This is when you can involve those folks to help you test out and get a better sense for not just is it technically accessible, but does it provide a good experience? This is just an example of what we might find with an automated testing tool for our websites. A couple things I want to point out here. One, this was a scan we did on one page using AxDev tools from DeQ. It scans a page in, I'd say, a matter of seconds. And with that, we're able to identify, in this case, 82 issues on the homepage of this particular site. So quick way to spot some big accessibility gaps. The other thing I'd call out here is a lot of these tools also help us to prioritize. So you'll see here that we have 34 critical and serious issues. These may prevent full barriers to folks with people with disabilities and even using our website. And so it can help us prioritize to knock these things out first. We also have 48 moderate issues, no minor ones. These are ones that still may have an impact. They shouldn't be full barriers, but they may create a less than ideal experience. So they may not be our first priority, but we still need to pay attention to these to make sure that we're not just checking the box of accessibility, but we are giving these folks the same great experience that others may get when they access your site. And then also just wanted to show what does this look like in the document space. So here we have a couple examples from Microsoft PowerPoint and their built-in accessibility checker, as well as Adobe Acrobat. It's helping us to spot things like missing alt text, potential reading order issues with slides. If you didn't know, slides have a reading order, and we want to make sure that it's presented the same way that you would verbally read the slide. So someone using a screen reader gets that information the right order and the right way. So these are those types of things that automated testing can help us to find. In terms of building the culture, once we have this, right, we need to know what can we do with it and how can we leverage it not only to create a backlog, because certainly this is helpful, right? With evaluations, we start to get our backlog of issues and we can plan for that remediation, but we can also use it to start building awareness in the organization. So some of those most common issues that we find in our evaluations can highlight key areas where teams need training and support in implementing accessibility. It can be used to highlight what types of barriers would people have when they access our content. What would the impact be for these individuals to build that awareness of what accessibility really means at a human level in your organization? And it gives us opportunities to spot processes where we can shift left, as we call it. A lot of times accessibility is left to like the testing phase. The testers will catch it and help us fix issues, but we want to infuse it, as we mentioned, across the process. So is it involved in your planning? Is it involved in procurement? Is it involved in design and development? Again, creating that shared responsibility and those processes that support accessibility end to end. So while these evaluations do help check the box and solve the problem of accessibility, they can also be a great initial teaching tool to build awareness in your organization. To continue with that theme of building skills and building an accessible organization, we'll go over to Rebecca, who's going to talk more about training and change management. And then we also have another poll question. To what extent are staff members in your organization aware of the importance of accessibility in their respective roles? What does that mean to them? Again, 0 meaning not aware at all, and 5 fully aware. And Rebecca, I'll turn it over to you for those poll results and for the content here.
Great. Thank you, Dan. Let's give everyone just a second to answer this poll. Jen, let me know if that pops up, the answers on your side. I feel like they're coming through a little quicker on your end.
Will do. All
There you
right.
go.
Looks like a pretty good mix here across. So you got some representation in each pocket. Highest again is in that 2 range, but just at 29%. So it looks like a lot of organizations are kind of at different places in the journey in terms of that roles and responsibilities aspect. So I'll let Rebecca talk a little bit more about how you can continue to work that through in your organization.
Great. Thank you, Dan. All right, let's dive into training and change management. So training serves as an important foundation. As Dan mentioned, we want every member of the team to understand their role and have the skills required to work towards an organization becoming and staying accessible. So again, this is not just about compliance, but empowering individuals with the resources and knowledge they need to make digital spaces inclusive. Now, alongside training, we want to think about change management. So we like to think of change management as a support system. It ensures that the training is not just a one-time event, but an ongoing process. It also provides support for our teams, helping them adapt, evolve, and integrate accessibility into their ways of working. So it's not just about what we learn, but how we make that learning part of our everyday work. So again, it's kind of a mindset shift from, checking the box to what are the things that we can do to continuously grow on our accessibility journey. Moving on to our next key point here, developing role-based training. So accessibility is an expansive topic. And again, it can be very overwhelming. So it can leave people unsure about where to start. So this is where role-based training comes in. Role-based training provides focused guidance. So it's about understanding that each person in the organization plays a unique role, and their understanding of accessibility should be aligned to that role. So for example, a designer is going to have different needs than a software engineer, a quality engineer, or a content creator. Breaking down training into smaller, digestible topics allows individuals and teams to create training plans that fit their specific needs. So on the next slide, we're going to give kind of an example framework of what role-based training can look like. All right, so you can see here on the left-hand side, we have kind of different roles in the organization, and potential curriculum that we'd be looking at for each role. So this middle section has high-level learning objectives and training needs. Then we have the modality and the level of effort. So is it going to be low, medium, or high based on the role? So for example, again, a content owner, all of these roles may have foundational curriculum that they need, but the content owner may be focused on document accessibility, some of those examples that Dan shared earlier. Whereas a quality engineer is probably going to need, additional testing tools, evaluation tools, and more technical aptitude. In this modality section, this could also include links to specific trainings that might be available. And then level of effort just kind of gives an idea of, what will be required based on these different roles. So just kind of a framework to help you kind of start to think through what the different roles are on the teams and what the training needs are. All right, moving on to coaching. So because learning accessibility often entails fundamental changes in the way that people work, coaching can be super helpful. So we need more than just training modules. We need a kind of a comprehensive approach to accessibility. So at Slalom, we've seen a lot of success with offering options like coaching sessions, dedicated office hours, and the ability to ask questions directly to accessibility experts. So really bridging that gap between theory and practical application, really helping folks understand their specific roles and providing that sort of support structure. And along this sort of same topic of coaching is accessibility advocates. So advocates can play a pivotal role in driving change across the organization, and I'm going to kind of share 3 different ways. The first one is providing training feedback. So accessibility advocates can review training plans and content. Their feedback can help the team understand what might work well, can help identify gaps and things that they might need to focus on in the future. So looking at those, reviewing those training plans. The next one is supporting communications. So advocates can become the key point of contact to articulate the program's vision, business objectives, and overall value to different departments. They are instrumental in providing support as teams to begin to learn those accessibility skills. And finally, leading by example. So accessibility advocates are leaders within their individual teams and departments. By modeling the behavior and changes required to create a more accessible organization, they become the catalysts for change. So identifying and empowering accessibility advocates can help embed accessibility into the DNA of the organization.
Yeah, and just
Right.
one thing on this too, when we've done this, we're usually looking for volunteers. We look for folks that want to self-select to be in this accessibility advocate role, folks that identify kind of with the mission behind implementing accessibility. And we tend to look for them again in all pockets of the organization. So not just focus on one team, but really look organization wide, knowing that each area will have their own needs and their own things they need to address. And so building this across the organization, again, helps to start create that shared responsibility, and making sure that we're not just getting to one department or one team, but we're really kind of sharing that knowledge and that future effort across the entire organization. So encourage you, if you want to do this, to really look organization wide, look for those volunteers. So we found there are often a lot of folks that will raise their hand and say, I think this is important work, and we'd like to be a part of it.
Thank you, Dan. Okay, and the last piece here I'm going to touch on is ongoing communications. So a few things that we want to continue communicating throughout the year, different avenues you might consider. One is just email. So email can be a great way to provide updates, reminders, and tips that can serve as reinforcement of ongoing accessibility initiatives. Creating an accessibility SharePoint. I think this one's super important. A SharePoint or a hub that's dedicated. It's a dedicated space in your organization, and it's a great way to centralize accessibility resources. So this can be the go-to hub for documents, guidelines, updates related to accessibility. It can foster a sense of accessibility community and ensure that the information is easily accessible to the team. Monthly newsletters can provide updates, success stories. You could share upcoming initiatives. It's also a great way to highlight the progress that's being made collectively. And then this last point, consider communicating to the public about your accessibility journey. I think this is an interesting way to build trust with the community, let people know that you're working on some of these issues, have a way that people can submit issues that they might be having as well, and providing, communication in that way as well. Dan, I don't know if you have anything else you want to touch on that last slide before I pass it back to you.
No, I think that's perfect.
All right, well, I will pass it back over to talk about building the roadmap.
Sounds great. And I think we have another poll question here, if I remember right. There it is. So in which specific areas do you feel your organization needs the most assistance with accessibility? So, we've seen a lot of different results in our previous poll questions. For where you're at, are you thinking about that assessment and evaluation phase? Are you thinking about training and skilling up your team? Getting new tools to support accessibility? What are you really thinking about, and what's important to your organization to take those next steps forward? This one isn't a scale, it's a free text. So folks will probably think about this one for a moment here and get those answers in. And then with that, again, in the next section, we'll start to see how do we think about phasing these types of activities in terms of building that culture. The roadmap that we'll get into is just one way and one set of things your organization can think about. There's not necessarily a perfect roadmap or a right or wrong way to do it. So as long as your organization's building that forward momentum and starting to take those steps, that's a fantastic roadmap to have. But just want to give you all some considerations. I think this one I don't get all the answers, but we can look into that later. So let's talk about the roadmap. How do we think about this in some different phases? So like we mentioned early on, right, it's important to understand where your organization is today and start to get that sense of the current state. So what can you do to start to understand where you are? So one thing you can do, as we talked about, is identify those high priority digital assets across the organization and develop a plan to test and evaluate those for accessibility. I'm sure folks are thinking, again, chiefly of their public facing website. But again, we've looked at internal training content, something widely used internally in organizations. We've looked at key forms that might be part of your organization's process for getting the services that you offer. So there's a lot of different types of content that we would want to identify and get a plan for evaluating. Then we can test that different type of content from across the organization to understand what accessibility barriers might exist. Again, you'll see here I've mentioned across the organization. We want to go into different departments and see what content HR has and what content finance has and what content IT is responsible for, and all of these different pockets in your organization, and start to build what we call a representative sample, and then do that evaluation. So we're not just understanding from one team or one department's perspective, we're getting that broader look. And then thinking to that culture building aspect, this is a great time to also understand the current skill sets around accessibility in your organization. What do people know today? And what might they need support with in the future? I can say probably more folks than not, this will be a new topic for them. Unfortunately, as we learn to create PowerPoints, right? I don't ever remember someone teaching me about accessibility in that. I don't remember someone teaching me accessibility in Excel when I first learned that tool, or even in design and development. Unfortunately, it's often a footnote in these programs. So this will be new to many, many folks, and they'll need that training and support. Then we can look at prioritizing steps to both get and stay accessible. So we want to create that prioritized backlog of accessibility issues to identify that path to remediation. So we, again, need to figure out what are these critical barriers in our content today, our websites, our tools, our social media, all those different types of content, and how do we identify those critical ones and put together a path to remediation. Based on those skill sets and the needs of folks in their individual roles, we want to develop those training plans, procure any necessary content that you may need to build those accessibility skills. I know OIT offers a number of different learning options through webinars, through resource documents, and through access to learning libraries. So that can often be a great place to start for your organization. We want to develop a robust process for receiving and actioning on accessibility feedback. We've talked about this a couple times throughout the presentation, but if someone encounters an issue on your website, how do they reach out to you and get support? This is a really critical function for a couple different reasons. One, you want to be able to provide that good customer service. You want to be responsive to the folks that are interacting with your agency and giving them that feedback. And this is often a good way, not a perfect way, and I can't give legal advice, so don't hold me to this. But organizations that implement this well and are very responsive to issues that may be out there tend to be less likely to end up in court over those same issues. So this is both a great community service, customer service function. It is also one good way to reduce your legal risk, but again, no promises there. I'm not an attorney, so I can't give that advice, but we do encourage folks to really have this process well supported on all of the different platforms where folks may interact with your content. Then we want to execute the plan, right? We've identified, we've tested, we've prioritized. Now we need to start really going in and making that content more accessible. So leverage that prioritized backlog to fix the issues you have. But also thinking to that future sustainment piece, right? We want to start building in those mechanisms to support accessibility over time, because that's what's going to allow it to be more efficient and effective. As folks tend to get started with this, there's a high spike. There's a lot of effort that goes into it. There's a lot of maybe even cost. But as you start to reach that sustainable level, if you build this into your processes, if you build skills internally to support accessibility, if you make those process improvements, we start to see that effort and that cost level out over time. because you've created the support to maintain accessibility. So really key as you're going through, not just fix what we find, but identify how did that issue get there in the first place? How do we make sure we prevent that issue from coming up in the future through better processes and better skills? And that's going to make this easier to maintain over time. And then communicate successes and next steps with the organization. Rebecca mentioned that in the change management piece. We want to be communicating often internally and perhaps even externally about where you are in the accessibility journey, what has been done, and what still needs to happen in the future as you grow in the accessibility space. And finally, we want to leverage data to continue improving accessibility over time. So put in some of those monitoring tools into place that can provide accessibility insights for websites and documents. Again, this goes back to, we mentioned the tool Site Improve. There is other monitoring software out there, but we know that Site Improve is an industry leader in the space that's well supported through OIT that many of you may be using today. It's got a lot of great reporting features that show how are we tracking over time. Are we fixing a lot of stuff? Or are we introducing new issues? Where are we at? For better or worse, it will give you that information to help you continue to spot gaps and improve how you're putting this into practice. We want to report on accessibility feedback received to identify additional fixes or training that may be needed. So in step 2, we talked about that robust feedback process. Not only should that be used to make those individual changes, but that data can also really support your understanding in who is struggling to access our content, what issues are they continuing to see, and are there any patterns in that data that, again, we can use to improve our processes, our training programs, the way that we build this into our way of working so that those issues are less likely, to go out in the future. It's always more effort and more time to fix things after the fact. So the more that we can do in our processes to implement those checks and to take care of them before they happen, again, that helps keep the effort and the sustainability of this type of work more consistent over time. And then, of course, celebrate key wins, keep that eye to the future. But, if you have those newsletters, if you have those SharePoint pages, not only celebrate the great things that have been done, but celebrate the people that are doing those things. Who in your organization is that accessibility advocate? Who has taken it upon them to do a really great job captioning a video you just put out? Who has made their PDF report more accessible? Who has made sure a key element of your website is accessible? Celebrate those teams, celebrate those people. Because as we've mentioned, this creates a lot of overwhelm at the start. These are new skills that folks are having to put into place. Early on, it can often feel like a disruption and a pain point into their way of working. And so I encourage you to celebrate those folks that are putting it into practice, encourage their peers to do so, and just recognize the hard work and the great work that folks in your organization are putting into this. So with that, we just wanted to talk about what's the most important thing your organization can do today to become more accessible. And an easy answer for that is to get started. I'm sure across the participants here today, there's a lot of different folks at different levels and different departments. And so what this looks like in your role may be unique to you, but this can be as simple as running a scan on one portion of your website. This can be as easy as picking up one PowerPoint presentation and evaluating accessibility. This can be asking your training team, hey, what trainings do we have to support accessibility? And making sure they're well shared, or if there aren't any, figuring out what it looks like to get those into place. Again, one thing we often see is when there is so much to do, as there often is when you're getting started with accessibility, it can be really scary to take that first step, and you can sort of get overwhelmed with the sheer volume of things. But any step that you can reasonably take forward is a great next step to take. So hopefully, if any of these things have resonated with you in the presentation today, that's something you can go back and start to work on within your organization, whether it's changing things organization-wide or starting to be that advocate on your team and building that kind of grassroots movement for change. With that, we do want to open up and leave plenty of space and time to answer the questions that you may have. We also wanted to share the contact information from our friends at SIPA and us here at the Slalom team, so that you can reach out to us with additional questions you may have or support you may need. We're always happy to work with folks around the state of Colorado where we live and work to improve the accessibility. So with that, we'll open it up to any additional questions that you all may have. And I know one in the chat, Allison, you had asked about the accessibility, and does this apply to all social media posts? And I know Matt gave you that answer that, you know, it's best to work with OIT and some upcoming rulemaking sessions on understanding that. I know Becky from OIT is on the call, who's a great wealth of knowledge on that subject. I also know sometimes it's frustrating when we have to punt answers like that, but it's, you know, we're just not able to offer that type of legal interpretation that can get us into hot water with those types of questions. So that is why we answer those questions in that way. We're not trying to be intentionally evasive. We're just making sure that you get to the right folks that can more concretely answer that question for you. But certainly I do encourage you to definitely make sure you're thinking about that eye to the future, and that your social media managers are getting those skills, and certainly starting to put that in practice going forward. And then your friends at OIT, and I saw Becky just dropped her contact information, can help you with more of that interpretation of the rules that we cannot.
And Becky, while we have you, is there anything you want to share, or does anyone have any questions for Becky in addition to the Slalom team?
Well, I did want to share one thing. So the fine folks over at Slalom mentioned newsletters, and we have one here for the whole state. Let me see if I can get it to go into the chat. It's fighting me. But if you want to look at past issues, it's oit.colorado.gov/accessibility/news. And I'll put it here in the chat in just a moment, so you can copy that link out. We have all of the newsletters that we've ever drafted on accessibility on that page. And so I encourage folks to check it out, because we've covered a lot of these topics and kind of through the state of Colorado lens. So I know especially state agencies love to know, like, what are other agencies doing and what does the whole state think on this particular thing? So I encourage folks to check those out as well.
Awesome. Thanks for that, Becky.
Yes, thank you. All right. Well, I'm not seeing any additional questions, but you know, if you have something come up later on, please don't hesitate to contact any of us. We're here to help you and learn more. You can go to sipa.colorado.gov to register for our future webinars. Obviously, we will have this one up on our YouTube channel as soon as we can get that processed and uploaded. So if you want to watch anything again, you're welcome to. And also find other webinars that we've had in the past that may have some good information for you. Our next webinar will actually be next week with Propeller, human-centered design. So we're hoping you're interested in that. Will join us. We have another on February 14th with NTT Data and February 28th with Tyler, Colorado. Again, we're here to help you find any services that you need. Cybersecurity, accessibility, anything, you name it. We've run the gamut there. We've got a monthly newsletter as well with chock full of good information that we hope you'll subscribe and check out. And then if you are interested again in getting a quote or more information from Slalom, please let us know. We would love to help you out. We have a survey that we're hoping that you will finish it for us, fill out. It's 3 questions, won't take you long. They'll help us plan for future webinars. With that, I'm going to let you all go with a few extra minutes in your day, and I wish you all well. Thank you again for joining us, and to the Slalom team for their wonderful presentation.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank
Really
you.
appreciate the time. Take care.